Om Tatsaviturvaram Rupam Jyoti Parasya Dhimahi Yanna Satyena Deepayet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. My dear brothers and sisters, boys and girls, welcome again to this today's program in the Yes.01 course. Today is the 13th of January, and 13 is notorious for being an unlucky day, but that's just a superstition. Once I was attending a conference of children's writers, and a very good children's writer, I'll not say a very famous one perhaps, because children's writers generally don't get famous. Her name is Pratibha Nath. She had won an award for writing a book, and she said 13 is not an unlucky number. That book had gone through 13 drafts before she finally sent it for publication. So 13 is not necessarily bad. You might have seen that we always start with music, and that puts us in the right frame of mind. And in live classes, in fact, generally what I did was to spot some singers within the class and encourage them to sing, not just alone, but also let the whole group join. And let's see, to some extent, we may be able to do that. So any of you sings and is fond of singing can send an email to let us know that you would like to sing in one of the classes. And especially if you can make at least a few more join in the singing, it'll create a good atmosphere. Today's topic, as you know, is about Sri Aurobindo. It's difficult to do justice to a phenomenon, not a man, but a phenomenon like Sri Aurobindo, because he himself said that his life was not for all to see. It was not lived on the surface. It was lived at a level where people would not be able to see it. But then all the same, we do talk about his biographical details. That's a weakness that we as human beings have. And that is the weakness to which I shall also succumb today. So now I think I'll go to the slides. It'll take a while. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Today's session is a part of the Yes program, which in turn is a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th year of India's independence. The topic is Sri Aurobindo. Who was Sri Aurobindo? Was he a writer, a philosopher, a freedom fighter, or a spiritual master? He was all these and more, and we shall try and see how just one person, if we may call him, could be all these. He was born on the 15th of August, 1872, in this house. As you can see, it's a palatial house, now called Sri Aurobindo Bhavan in Kolkata. And from that, you can make out he was born in an affluent family. His father was a medical doctor, Dr. Krishnadhan Ghosh, who had his advanced or specialist training in medicine at Aberdeen, Scotland. His mother was Swaranlata Devi, and you can see her with Sri Aurobindo in this picture. Sri Aurobindo's father, like most of the educated people those days, and to some extent even today, believed that our own civilization, that is the Indian civilization, is now obsolete. And if we have to keep pace with the world, we'll have to learn the ways of the Western world. And therefore, he made sure that his children were shielded from all influences Indian as far as possible. So when the children were very young, he engaged for them a British governess to look after them. And as soon as Sri Aurobindo was a little further grown up, he went to this school, Loreto Convent School in Darjeeling, which was run by the Irish nuns. And when he was a little further grown up means 7-year-old, he, along with his 2 elder brothers, was taken to England so that they could continue their further studies there. And there Sri Aurobindo left the children with Mr. Druitt, Mr. William Druitt, and his wife. And here you can see in this picture, Sri Aurobindo and his 2 brothers with Mr. Druitt in Manchester. Sri Aurobindo gave evidence of his sharp intellect. When he was hardly 12, his poetry started getting published in British magazines. And in the class, he always stood out as an exceptionally bright student. After his initial learning at home, he was sent to the St. Paul's School in London. And when he was, after leaving school, he joined the King's College at Cambridge. And again, one of his teachers remarked that in the several years, perhaps 20 years or so, he had never seen an answer sheet as good as the ones that Sri Aurobindo turned out in the exams. His father's intention of sending Sri Aurobindo to England was that he should return and become an ICS, Indian Civil Service officer. But while Sri Aurobindo was still in England, he came across some groups that were fighting for the freedom of the country. And therefore, he decided that instead of coming back to India and serving a government that had enslaved us, he would rather come and participate in the freedom struggle. And therefore, he made sure that he will not qualify for the ICS. And how did he do that? By not appearing for the horse riding test. To go through this exam, to pass the horse riding test was one of the qualifying requirements for ICS, and he absented himself from it. He was given 3 opportunities and he remained absent during each of these. And therefore, he returned without qualifying for the ICS. And in fact, although he had completed almost all the requirements for getting a graduate degree from Cambridge, and he just had to spend some more time, which was mandatory. He had cleared all the exams, but he had to spend some more time to be able to qualify for the degree. But then he didn't care for the degree either, and therefore he returned without actually getting the degree. In fact, if he had applied for the degree, since he had cleared all the exams, they might have made a concession and given him the degree even in spite of not spending enough time there. But then he didn't apply for it. He didn't care for the degree. He came back without a graduate degree and without qualifying for ICS. Now, when he came back, what did he do? Before that, he landed at the Mumbai port, came by ship, and he left as, on the 12th of January, Swami Vivekananda's birthday, in 1893. That is when Swami Vivekananda was exactly 30 years old. So that is the day Sri Aurobindo left London for coming to India, and he landed at the Mumbai port, and he experienced a vast calm descend on him. He felt the difference in the atmosphere of this sacred land, India, Bharatvarsh, and that was such a uplifting and soothing experience for him. What did he do after landing there? He went to the Maharaja of Baroda, who had interviewed him in England, and told him that as soon as you come, you'll get a job. Of course, the type of job that the Maharaja had in mind for him was that of an administrator, because he thought here is a young man, a bright young man, who is preparing to complete the requirements for the Indian Civil Service, and therefore it will be nice to have him in the administration. Now, what did Sri Aurobindo do in Baroda, or Vadodara as it is now called? He, of course, did administrative work, but then that is something he didn't enjoy. He also did teaching. He started teaching English and French, which he enjoyed. But apart from that, he started writing. Some writing was poetry, which he was actually by nature a poet. But then he also wrote many articles to galvanize the youth of the country, to mobilize them, to make them conscious of what their duty at that point in time, at that stage in the history of the country was, to work for the freedom of the country. And in those days, the printed word carried a lot of weight because it was not as commonplace as it is today. And therefore, it had wide circulation, whatever he wrote. And young people did really take note of it. And silently, he started emerging as one of the important leaders of the freedom movement. Perhaps even more important, keeping in view the ultimate mission in life that he had, was that he started learning Sanskrit. And why did he do that? Because he realized that while he knew so much about the Western civilization, having stayed in England for 14 years, from 1879 through 1893, having stayed there for 14 years, and with his sharp intellect, he had not only learned many European languages apart from English, understood the Western civilization, but he had also had a critical look at it and seen through the hollowness of this civilization. He knew that in spite of all the glamour that it has on the surface, it will probably not last very long. But all the same, that is something that he knew about the Western civilization. When it came to the Indian culture, he realized that he hardly knew anything about it. And he tried to make up this deficiency in a concerted, serious manner. And therefore, he started learning Sanskrit. And he learned it within a few months so well that hardly a month after returning from England, he was already translating some parts of Mahabharata. So just through his own efforts, he learned Sanskrit, and then he read all the ancient Indian scriptures in their original. This process went on for almost another 14 years. And he also started practicing some of the practices of some yogic practices like pranayamas. And then he also turned to a guru, Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, whom he asked for some instructions so that he could acquire those yogic powers which would help him secure freedom for the country. I'm not sure whether those instructions were helpful in securing freedom for the country, but Vishnu Bhaskar Lele did tell him something about how to achieve an inner silence, a total silence of the surface mind, so that one could look deeper within. And what a remarkable student Sri Aurobindo turned out to be. Within 3 days, he went into a silence, a state of samadhi, which an ordinary person does not achieve in a whole lifetime. He, in fact, experienced the unmanifest divine, that is, the divine which is formless in nature. That is what he experienced within 3 days. And having seen that, Vishnu Bhaskar really told him that now what you have heard is your mantra and you can be on your own. Why he adopted a guru? That's again an interesting question. In fact, all those, including Sri Aurobindo, who did not really need a guru, also adopted a guru to set the right example. Because the fact is that the majority of us do need a guru in life. Now, the result of all this that he did at Baroda was that he became a totally unprecedented combination in history. A perfect synthesis of the East and the West, a sharp intellect, and phenomenal spiritual capacity. This is a combination that is totally unprecedented in history and unlikely to be repeated in the near future. And then, after spending about 14 years in Baroda, I always like to call it 14 because then, the 2 periods in England and Baroda become equal, and it looks like two periods of 14 years in exile, the type of exile that Rama had, 14 years in the forest. So do banvas ho gaye, 14 in England and 14 in Baroda. The process of leaving Baroda had started more or less in 1905, when the British decided to divide Bengal into two. But then Sri Aurobindo participated in the freedom struggle, but didn't break his links with Baroda. In 1906, he applied for 1 year leave, and the last visit that he made to Baroda was in 1907. So if we take 1907 as the year in which he left Baroda, it comes to exactly 14 years. And here you can see him when he was leaving Baroda with his students. His students not just liked him and admired him, they literally worshipped him. Because he was not just an excellent teacher, but they had also realized that he was an excellent human being. In fact, he was already a yogi, although not known as a yogi yet. And here you can see him with some of his students. And one of the most famous ones who sort of is probably K.M. Munshi, who went on to establish Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. So he came back from Baroda, severed all his connections with Baroda in 1907, and it was precipitated by the British deciding to divide Bengal into two parts. In fact, that became a national movement and intensified the struggle for freedom. Now, what did Sri Aurobindo do in Bengal? Many things, as in Baroda. In 1906, the country realized that if we have to progress, if we have to secure freedom, one of the important requirements also is that we should have our own national system of education. And therefore, a college, the National College, was established in Calcutta, and Sri Aurobindo was offered to take over as the first principal of that college, which he did in 1906, and continued there for about a year till 1907. Why he left was because he was getting more deeply involved in the freedom struggle, and therefore he thought that if there is any sort of a litigation against him, he goes to prison, etc., then that might jeopardize the college also. And that's why he left that college in 1907, but he was the first principal there. And even within that 1 year, once again, his students came to worship him. What else did he do while he was in Bengal? He started once again writing articles, and Bande Mataram was one of the major ones before he went to prison in 1908, and Karma Yogin, the other one, after he came out of prison. Now, what was the difference between these two? They were both talking about the justification for India getting its freedom. It was a right that we had. He didn't look upon it as a concession that we had to secure from the British. But there was a difference between these two. And that will become a little more clear after we go on why that difference. Bande Mataram was before he went to jail, and the articles were primarily political, but they had a spiritual touch. In Karma Yoga, it was just the opposite. The articles were spiritual in nature, but had a bit of a political orientation. One of the most important things that he did through these writings, particularly in the Bande Mataram, was to give to the country a blueprint, a clear sort of a plan for the freedom struggle. And he said one of the important elements of it should be a mass movement, not a movement involving just a few freedom fighters, but involving the people in general. And how they could participate was through a boycott, a non-cooperation. And why that is important is because it was difficult to fight the British through an armed struggle. But he said that we can make it difficult and unprofitable for the British to rule us. And then they would automatically leave. And there are many types of boycott that one can indulge in while hardly breaking any rules. And he proposed 5 types of boycott. Economic boycott, that is, do not buy anything manufactured in England. Use only things which have been made in India, the Swadeshi movement. Then educational boycott. Don't go to schools and colleges run by the British. Start our own schools and colleges, which impart education which is in keeping with the soul of India, the nation's soul. Judicial boycott. If you have a dispute, don't go to the courts run by the British, have your own courts, something like panchayats. And executive boycott, if the government frames any rules which are unfair, don't follow them. Be ready to face the punishment, but don't follow those rules. Then finally, social boycott. Now, social boycott can be very important in a country like India particularly. That is, those people who refuse to cooperate in the other 4 types of boycotts, they should be boycotted by the rest of the society. Means don't talk to them, stop attending any functions that they organize, stop marrying your children into their families, and so on and so forth. So sort of, they should feel that they have now become outcasts because, for example, they are continuing to buy things made outside India. So if they wear, say, clothes made in England or use any articles made outside the country, then don't have any social relationship with those families. So social boycott. So within a few years, Sri Aurobindo created such a ripple throughout the country that the British started looking for an opportunity to arrest him. And the opportunity came soon enough. In 1908, 2 innocent British women died as a result of a bomb blast. The bomb was thrown by some revolutionaries, and their target, in fact, was a judge who was handing over very severe and unfair sentences to freedom fighters. For example, a 15-year-old was sentenced to 15 lashes right there in the court just because he was 15-year-old. Now, they wanted to kill that judge, and they thought the judge was in this carriage. But there was a mistake. Instead of the judge, there were 2 women there, and they died. And as a result, as it happens in such cases, all those who could be in any way even remotely connected with the bomb blast were arrested. And one of the around 40 people who were arrested was Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo was amongst those who were arrested in connection with this bomb blast. The trial went on for about a year, and midway through the trial came to defend him an eminent lawyer who was also a patriot, Chitranjan Das Gupta. And to cut a long story short, the lawyer gave up all his other practice and devoted all his time to this single case. And a statement that he made towards the end of the trial in the court has become prophetic. He said something to the effect that this man who is here is in fact such that his voice will continue to echo for a long time all over the world, even after all of us are dead and gone. This was a prophetic statement that the lawyer made. But then one of the important things that happened during this 1 year, which makes one feel that in fact it was a divine intervention to take Sri Aurobindo out of the freedom struggle, was that Sri Aurobindo discovered during this 1 year the mission of his life. In fact, when he was taken to the prison, he started wondering why this noble task in which he was engaged has been interrupted. If there is a God, why this work was interrupted? It's so easy for God to give what he wants. After all, he's not asking for anything personal. Then why has this work been interrupted? And within a few days, he got the answer. And the answer was that this work has been interrupted because the bonds that he could not break, the divine has broken for him. Now, what were those bonds? Attachment to work, especially when it's a noble task like the freedom struggle, can itself become a bond. But that is not what Sri Aurobindo was made for. And he started feeling that perhaps it is because of that I have been brought here. And like Arjuna, he asked Lord Krishna, tell me what I have to do. And this he could do because he had one major spiritual experience while he was in prison. For some time in prison, he was alone, and sometimes with a group of other inmates. During some of these moments, especially in solitary confinement, he had an experience of Lord Krishna, and he started seeing Krishna everywhere. in the prison wall, in the guards and the sentries, in the defense counsel and the prosecution counsel, in the judge. He started seeing Lord Krishna everywhere. And therefore, he could have a dialogue with Krishna. He could ask him, the way Arjun had done in the Gita, what do you expect of me? Should I continue with the freedom struggle, or is there something else that you want me to do? These were all details which he revealed soon after he was acquitted, released from jail in 1909. Now, to go back a bit, all the details that he told, and some of which I have just mentioned briefly, why did the divine had to intervene to send him to prison just to get him out of the freedom struggle? Now, this becomes easy to understand because while the freedom struggle was a noble task, there were several thousands and lakhs of people, young people, courageous people, people with great moral strength and character, who were willing to participate in the freedom struggle, and they were doing it. Those were the people he came across in prison. Sri Aurobindo saw them in prison, and that made him feel that perhaps I made a mistake. I'm not indispensable. So the divine wanted to tell him, you are not indispensable for the freedom struggle. But then why he had to be pulled out? What is it that he had to do which was more important than being engaged in the freedom struggle? This we can easily understand if we once again, remember that he was an unprecedented combination in history. A synthesis of the East and the West, a very sharp intellect, and phenomenal spiritual capacity. A totally unprecedented combination in human history. Such a combination had not been brought into the world to be battered and bruised by the British police, to be incarcerated in prisons. This combination had been brought for something higher, which would be of significance to the whole world. And that is why the divine had to intervene, interrupt his participation in the freedom struggle, and keep him in the prison for 1 year, which was necessary for him to discover the mission of his life. And when that mission had been discovered, arrangements were also made for his acquittal, for his release. He was kept in prison for not a day more, not a day less than was absolutely necessary. Now, what were the arrangements made for his release? One of the things, of course, was the defense that he got from Chittaranjan Das Gupta. But then the interesting thing was, normally, it is the client who provides the facts to the lawyer, and it's the lawyer's job to present those facts to the judge in the way that they can be interpreted in such a way, the facts can be interpreted in such a way that the law is in favor of the client. But Sri Aurobindo got instructions from Sri Krishna, don't tell anything to the lawyer, I'll instruct the lawyer. So Sri Aurobindo didn't even provide the facts to the lawyer, and still the lawyer could prepare an excellent brief, because perhaps the lawyer was once again receiving instructions from Sri Krishna. What he had to say in the brief was coming from a higher source. The lawyer became a channel for that higher force to work through him to prepare the brief in such a way that it would be in favor of Sri Aurobindo. The second important thing that once again can be looked upon as a divine intervention was something foolish that the British did. When something has to happen, even very wise people can end up doing foolish things. And what was that foolish thing? The foolish thing that the British did was to have in this case a judge, Mr. Beechcroft, who happened to be Sri Aurobindo's classmate in England. Now, they could have easily thought that perhaps this judge will have a soft corner for Sri Aurobindo. There was no scarcity of judges. Why couldn't they appoint somebody else? And one can sort of visualize that after going through a few hundred pages in the proceedings of the case, which were devoted to Sri Aurobindo, the judge, when he came to the conclusion that the evidence is not enough to convict Sri Aurobindo, this soft corner that the judge had for Sri Aurobindo might have played some role in the judgment that he delivered. So the result was that through apparently a divine intervention, Sri Aurobindo was released almost exactly a year after he was arrested. And soon after his release, he addressed about 600 people in a place called Uttarpada. So this speech has become famous as the Uttarpada speech. And this is perhaps the only occasion in which he talked at length about his personal spiritual experiences. And that's how we know all the details of how he discovered the mission of his life. Now, what was the mission of his life? Twofold, one in relation to India and the other in relation to the world. India had been in a state of slumber for about 1,000 years. The decline had been further intensified by slavery. And the result was that Indians had come to not only go into a slumber, but also develop a strong inferiority complex. And they had to be made to realize their greatness, their strength, their right to freedom, and the role that they could in fact play, the role that India could play in the spiritual upliftment of the world. So India had to be once again prepared for its role as the Vishwaguru, as the Guru to the world. So this was in relation to India. What was the other goal in relation to the world? To provide the necessary wisdom to the world in contemporary terms. Wisdom based on ancient spiritual wisdom, but then provided in contemporary terms in a language that particularly the Western world would understand. Because this was something which was clearly the need of the future for the West. And one can take it as a part of the divine scheme that one by one, spiritual masters came to fulfill that need. Because the divine is looking at the world as a whole. The world as a whole should become a better place. And for that, spiritual wisdom is essential. And why was it particularly necessary for the Western world at that juncture? It was because Europe had gone through more than 300 years of the European Renaissance by then. And during this period, science had become a very successful enterprise. Science had led to technology, technology to industrial revolution. And all this had made our life so comfortable, transport quick, communications easy, that it had created a it has had a hypnotizing effect on the world. And science had become a sort of a new religion. So that in the West, religion was banished in favor of science, and all hopes were placed in science that it would now solve the problems of human existence, such as inequality, injustice, misery, and suffering. But that didn't happen. When that didn't happen, the West pressed into service once again the same instrument which had led to the growth of science and technology for solving these problems of human existence. And what was that tool? That tool was rationality. So on rational grounds, they came up with systems of government which would solve these problems. And two of the contrasting products of this line of thinking were democracy and communism. Both very rational, both very well-intentioned, and both failed. And Sri Aurobindo visualized it right then, around more than 100 years ago, that they would fail. And the finest product of rationality was rationalistic humanism. And Sri Aurobindo had once again seen 100 years ago that even that would fail. Why all these attempts, in spite of their intentions and rationality, were doomed to failure, were because while they were formulated by people who had all the good intentions and were idealistic by nature, they were implemented by ordinary people whose level of consciousness was not the same. And therefore, in any system, there will always be some people who will have more power than the others. And these people would then corner more of the resources for themselves. And the human intellect is so tricky that that type of inequality, that cornering of the resources by the minority would generate, that would be rationalized and legalized, so that the laws in themselves will start favoring this type of inequality. Inequality in turn leads to injustice, and that in turn leads to cruelty, misery, and suffering. So that is why these rationalistic approaches were doomed to failure. But then Sri Aurobindo says that all these failures would have also taught the world a lesson. The lesson, what is it that does not work? And if rationality doesn't work, what will they do? They'll start looking at something higher than reason. And where will they find it? In ancient Indian wisdom. And therefore, this wisdom needed to be made available to them in their language in contemporary terms. And the beginning was made by Swami Vivekananda at Chicago. He created that receptivity over the next few years by staying in the West. And the result was that when Sri Aurobindo started writing and Sri Aurobindo Ashram was established a little later, Sri Aurobindo and the mother did not have to move out of Pondicherry for a single day because the receptivity had already been created. So we can look upon this entire sort of these events, Swami Vivekananda and then Sri Aurobindo coming as part of a divine design to take ancient Indian wisdom to the world at a time when they really needed it. Because you don't really learn anything from something unless you need it, unless you feel the need, unless you're thirsty for that wisdom. And the West was thirsty at that stage in the 19th century when Swami Vivekananda went there in 1893. So that was the stage towards the end of 19th century that they were really thirsty for it. The experiments that they're trying had either failed or were seen to be failing. So it started at then. So Sri Aurobindo had to do that. He had to provide that wisdom to the world, which it would be looking for very soon. So these were the two things that he was given, and he was extremely well equipped for both these roles. And that is why he had to be pulled out of the freedom struggle. So he came out of prison in 1909, and he knew what he had to do. And then in the beginning of 1910, he got advance information that the office of Bande Mataram would be raided and he would be arrested. And he got a command from within in a voice that he had come to trust, the same voice which had spoken to him in prison, the voice of Sri Krishna. So he had come to trust this voice and obey it without asking any questions. This voice told him, go to Chandarnagar. And he left immediately late at night with hardly any preparation for Chandarnagar. And then after he had stayed there for about a month, again the same voice spoke to him, go to Pondicherry. And he left Chandarnagar. Chandarnagar and Pondicherry both were French colonies. And he was getting those commands from within because the British could not easily pursue him, could not pursue him as easily in French colonies as they could in British India. So the result was that on the 4th of April, 1910, he was in Pondicherry with a few friends who had also been participating with him in the freedom struggle. Now, as if by divine design, once again, the same year, 1910, when he went to Pondicherry, came to Pondicherry a Frenchman, Paul Richard. And he was looking for, always looking for holy men. And therefore, in Pondicherry, he went to Sri Aurobindo and was so impressed with him that he decided to bring his wife also there. And he came a second time in 1914, 4 years later, with his wife. And who was she? She was Mira Alfessa, whom we today all know as the mother. And when the mother came and was with Sri Aurobindo, there was as if some sort of an instant recognition, as if they had known each other for ages. And it's just a sort of the outer circumstances in the world that had kept them thousands of miles away from each other, unknown to each other. She knew that she had found her guru. She had been seeing visions of a face looking like that of Sri Aurobindo since her youth, after reading the Gita in French, and she had started calling this face Krishna. And she knew that she has met her Krishna. This is her guru. The stay in 1914 was rather brief, just about a year. But then it was an important year because while Sri Aurobindo knew the mission of his life, he had been spending this time of 4 years from 1910 to 1914, more or less on further deepening his personal sadhana. He was more or less in solitude for these 4 years. So he had not really been able to externalize in terms of what he had to do for the country and the world. And that process was triggered by the arrival of the one whom we today call the mother. She her husband Paul Richard, and Sri Aurobindo discussed and decided that they would bring out a monthly journal, which they named Arya, which would bring together the religious and spiritual traditions of the world. The journal was started on the 15th of August, that is Sri Aurobindo's birthday, in the year 1914. But then the journal had been coming out just for a few months, and the mother and her husband left for France because Paul Richard was called back to France to participate in the World War efforts related to the First World War. And so they had to leave. So they left on the 22nd of February in 1915, less than a year after they came, 22nd of February, because just a day after the mother's birthday. So that day they left, went back. But then this process of publishing the Arya that they triggered was a major step. And what Sri Aurobindo did was to bring out more or less single-handed each issue of about 64 pages, month after month, for more than 6 years. This process went on till January 1921. And what was this journal about, the Arya? What Sri Aurobindo did was to pick up 6 or 7 themes, such as the Indian culture, yoga, spiritual philosophy, the history of the world looked at from a psychological standpoint, and the scriptures such as the Veda, the Upanishads, and the Gita. And on each of these topics, he wrote one article in each issue, or more or less each issue. Later on, what was done was to dismantle these issues of the Arya and put together the articles on a particular theme in the same sequence as they had appeared in the Arya. For example, there were 48 articles on the Gita. When they were put together, it gave us a book called the Essays on the Gita. In the same way, articles related to yoga, when they were put together in the same sequence as they appeared in the Arya, it gave us the synthesis of yoga. And the result was that we had Sri Aurobindo, writing for the Arya. And the result was that we had, over a period of the 6 years, some of the so-called major works of Sri Aurobindo. Why I'm saying so-called is because there is really no minor work of Sri Aurobindo. Each work is a major work. But these are the works which are sometimes referred to as the major works of Sri Aurobindo, such as the Foundations of Indian Culture, Essays on the Gita, The Secret of the Veda, these translations of the Upanishads, the Synthesis of Yoga, The Life Divine, and The Human Cycle, The Ideal of Human Unity. Now, all these were generated by this monthly publication, the Arya, over a period of more than 6 years. Even if we take away everything else that Sri Aurobindo did, just this literature will earn him a very important place in the spiritual history of the world. Because what he generated in these 6.5 years or so is more than what an average person can read in a lifetime, leave aside, understand, and act upon. And they have, in fact, in them a whole blueprint for what India as a nation can do and what the world can do, the spiritually awake individuals in the world can do, and how it can lead to an entire, one can say, makeover of the human race, remaking of man. That is what it can lead to, so that the human beings will become better. And if human beings become better, the world becomes a better place. So this has that blueprint and homework for several centuries to come. That is what these publications from the Arya are based. And in what sort of language? In elegant language. English that is not only flawless, but also poetic in nature. Even prose reads like poetry. As if on cue, when this publication in the Arya was coming to an end, in 1920, on the 24th of April, once again came the mother, this time with her husband, as well as one more friend, Dorothy. And after a short stay, after a few months, Paul went back. These two ladies stayed back in Pondicherry. From 1920 to 1926, the mother herself was more or less in her personal sadhana in solitude. She was already a highly evolved person. She didn't need that sadhana, but she behaved as if she was a disciple, as if she was starting from scratch. So she went into that solitude to be under the guidance of Sri Aurobindo directly. And this solitude was interrupted by Sri Aurobindo. In 1926, he decided to go into seclusion on the 24th of November, 1926, and requested the mother to take charge of the ashram. Now, when the mother started taking care of the physical needs of the ashram and started guiding the disciples there, they were just about 25. And by the time she left the body in 1973, they were more than 1,000. So the ashram was essentially a creation of the mother. And it had great significance because Sri Aurobindo had given the philosophy. But then she was the one who gave it a practical shape. And that is never easy, because to translate an ideal into practice always involves some degree of dilution of the ideal. And the one who could do it without that type of dilution was the mother. And Sri Aurobindo himself said that if the mother had not come, his philosophy might have stayed in books. It was the mother who gave it a practical shape in Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Pondicherry. And why that was important was because Sri Aurobindo had laid great emphasis on bringing spirituality into daily life, into worldly life. Can it be really done? Can it be done in the modern world? And how can it be done? This was something new because it was happening after more than 1,000 years. Because over these 1,000 years of decline of this country, India, the ashrams had come to be equated with old age homes where no such active work was going on. So spiritual life was considered something entirely separate from worldly life. A dichotomy had been created between worldly life and spiritual life. And it was assumed that spirituality is for old age, it is for those who have renounced the world, and for the ordinary person, it is just ordinary worldly life. So that dichotomy had been created. We had forgotten how to bring spirituality into daily life. And therefore, the ashram at Pondicherry became a sort of a laboratory to see whether that can actually happen in today's world. And the mother showed it can be done. And that is the significance of Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, which was essentially her creation. Because not only she set up all the departments, etc. Of course, we'll talk more about her tomorrow. All the departments, etc. as the need came, but she also answered all the questions put forth by the disciples with great patience, including some very ridiculous questions. She never lost her patience and answered all of them. Now, what are the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the mother? I thought it will not be out of place to talk about them very briefly. First thing, as I've said perhaps many times by yesterday and today, is life affirmation. That is, do not reject worldly life, embrace worldly life, but bring spirituality into it. So spirituality is not for those who retire to the Himalayas or a cave. It is for each one of us, and each one of us can improve our lives through bringing spirituality into it. And the rationale for this is that the world is not an illusion, but a manifestation of the divine. Manifestation means another form. The divine has chosen to become visible in the form of this universe. Because Sri Aurobindo had an experience of both the unmanifest divine and the manifest divine. The unmanifest divine in Baroda within 3 days, and the manifest divine in prison. He saw Lord Krishna, and he saw Lord Krishna in everywhere, as manifesting itself as the walls and the trees, and also as the guards and the sentries and the lawyers and the judge. So in the other inmates of prison, in all of them, he saw Sri Krishna. So he had an experience of both. And therefore, he could say with confidence, based on his personal experience, that the world is not an illusion. It is just that the divine has taken another form. The form that it has taken may not be perfect, but that is a part of the play, the game that the divine has decided to play while creating this world. And what we should do is not to reject it, because we can't accept one part of or one aspect of the divine, that is the unmanifest, and reject the other. Instead, we should seek to transform, to change the manifestation in such a way that it becomes more worthy of the one that is manifesting. One of the lines which Sri Aurobindo wrote in his Upanishad, very few know that Sri Aurobindo, in fact, also has written an Upanishad himself in the Sanskrit language. And one of the lines that occurs in that is Jagadapi Brahma Satyam Namithya. Jagadapi Brahma, this Jagat is also, Jagat, that is the universe, is also Brahma, that is divine. The universe is also divine, Satyam Namithya, and therefore it is true, it is not for falsehood. It is not an illusion. Since the universe is also divine, it is a reality, it is truth. It may be a partial reality, it may be a temporary reality, but all the same, it is not unreal, it is not false. And therefore, we should not be rejecting it. Instead, we should seek to transform it so that it befits the one that it manifests. And do we have to do it just because he has said it? No, because if we bring spirituality into daily life, it fills our life with love, peace, joy, and fulfillment. That is something which we are all looking for. The second important feature of the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother is evolution. Now we have some idea of evolution from the study of biology, and sort of people believe that Darwin told us that first there were monkeys and then we became men. That is what evolution is about. But that is only on the surface. And there is one major difference between that and this. While Darwin thought that somehow it happened, that evolution took place, perhaps as a result of struggle for existence and so on. But in fact, in spiritual terms, evolution is something which on the surface looks similar, but actually it is something quite different. When the divine decided to manifest as this universe, it was an act of gross self-limitation. It limited itself, but then started the opposite process of revealing itself more and more. And that is what evolution is about. So the possibility of man were already there in the monkey. The manifestation was limited, but when more of what the divine in the monkey was revealed, it gave us a man. So that is what evolution is about. So the possibilities of man were already hidden, just as the possibility of a tree is hidden in a seed. So in the same way, the possibility of human beings was hidden in the monkey, and that is what evolution is about. But then, is man the final product of evolution? Far from so. And if the trend so far is any indication, the divine will continue to reveal itself more and more in its creation and give way to a creature which is far better than human being, a creature who manifests more of the divine than the human being does. But man is unique all the same. The uniqueness of man is that unlike perhaps animals, man has an urge to evolve and also has the capacity to do so. And therefore, further evolution from man onwards does not have to depend on the slow process of evolution that has guided it so far. This evolution can now take place partly as a result of human effort, which means man can collaborate with nature in carrying evolution to the next stage. And Sri Aurobindo believed that this next stage is not too far away. It is round the corner, which means we are poised for that leap in evolution. And this is closely linked to the third important aspect of Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's teachings, and that is the futuristic vision of the world. Now, if we are poised for the next stage in the next leap in evolution, it will give rise to a creature who is distinctly better than human beings, manifesting divinity a lot better than the human beings do. The fact that this can happen is quite obvious because a few exceptional human beings have already been doing it. Those are our rishis and the mystics. They have already been taking their level, have been able to raise their level of consciousness to a level where they are manifesting the divinity hidden in them almost completely. But then what has been confined to a select few so far, will become more and more of the norm. That is what will change what the typical human nature is. That is, the typical human being will change, the average human being will change. That is what is important, because a select few, while their effect has been positive on the world, they have not been able to change the world, because the average human being still continues to be half animal and half divine, far away from the divine, more animal than the divine. And that is why the world has remained more or less as it is, as a place full of misery and suffering for thousands of years. But just because it has been for thousands of years so, doesn't mean that it always has to be so. It can change, and it will change when the average human being changes. And the next leap in evolution being round the corner indicates that that is the direction in which we are likely to move pretty soon, so that the typical human nature, the average human nature, will change. So when that happens, then the human beings will change and the world will become a better place to live in. So this type of a clear vision of a better world as a result of further evolution is the third major feature of the teachings of Sri Aurobindo. And what will that future world will be like? It will be characterized by a feeling of oneness, which in turn will inspire love, and we'll move away from all religions towards spirituality. This is one of my favorite quotes from Savitri, because when the world is full of love, the love will find an expression. And what is the expression of love? To share. And in fact, sharing is not just giving, sharing is also getting, because we get more joy when we share. Incomplete is the joy unless it is shared. Is the world really moving away from religions towards spirituality? Every year, the Time magazine brings out an issue which has, according to them, what they perceive as 10 things that are changing the world. 10 ideas that are changing the world. The 2008 issue, which carried these 10 ideas that are changing the world, one of the ideas that they mentioned was the growth of nuns. N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. The growth of nuns. Who are these nuns? Nuns are a growing tribe of young people in the West who openly say, for example, if you ask them in a census, what is your religion? They openly declare, I have no allegiance to any organized religion, but I am spiritual. I believe in a higher force. Now, that is the fastest growing tribe of young people in the world today, and that is changing the world. So what Sri Aurobindo and the mother had seen is actually happening. Now, after Sri Aurobindo, going back now again to 1926, when the ashram was formally established in Pondicherry and the mother was requested to take charge of it, what did Sri Aurobindo himself do? He left the body in 1950. What did he do between 1926 and 1950? Without going into the invisible work that he did for bringing this higher consciousness down on earth and accelerating the process of further evolution, what can be easily seen, the visible work that he did was, firstly, that he continued to answer questions that were sent by the disciples. He was in seclusions, but the disciples could always send him questions in writing, to which he always replied. And that even the letters which are available, some might have been lost, but the letters which are available have now been compiled into 4 volumes. So there are 4 volumes of letters on yoga, and this is a very precious resource because that carries answers straight from the master to questions and difficulties of the type that seekers had those days and continue to have even today. So that way, letters on yoga is a very precious resource. The second important thing that he did during this period was to complete Savitri. In fact, some portions of it had been written earlier, but were essentially a product of this period while he was in seclusion. And Savitri is a scripture, a book that has everything from spiritual philosophy, including the basis of yoga, the sadhana in yoga, and also some occult knowledge, which Sri Aurobindo has sort of put into Savitri as his yoga and the mother's yoga. Of course, he has called it Ashwapati's yoga and Savitri's yoga. But just about everything is there in Savitri. So these were the two major sort of visible creations of Sri Aurobindo during this period. He left the body in 1950 on the 5th of December, and the body was kept without using any ice or refrigeration, and it did not decay. Finally, it was laid to rest on the 9th of December in 1950. It was against the rules of the French government to keep a body that long. And normally one would expect that the body would start putrefying in the heat and the high temperatures that exist in Pondicherry. But this was a special body. This was a body that had undergone the type of transformation which could defy the normal laws of matter, which are characterized by decay and degeneration. And that's why the body stayed fresh all these days. While the Samadhi is in Pondicherry, in the Delhi ashram, we are fortunate to have the relics of Sri Aurobindo enshrined here. In this little shrine, you find at the center there's a cube, and at the base of the cube are the relics of Sri Aurobindo. And the Delhi ashram was fortunate in being the first place to which the relics were sent by the mother, the first place outside Pondicherry. The relics came here in 1957, about a year after the formal establishment of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. There are many biographies of Sri Aurobindo. Here's a small selection of them. Probably one of the most comprehensive and well-researched biographies of Sri Aurobindo is by Professor K.R.S. Iyengar. There's another one by an early disciple, A.B. Purani. And then there are shorter ones, 100 to 200 pages long. One is by one of the early disciples, Navajata. This one has been published by the National Book Trust. And another one by Pramod Kumar Sen, published by Harper. And then these are two excellent biographies which deal with only the period before Pondicherry. One is a very recent publication written by Professor Manoj Das. We call him Manoj Da, who has done something which is extremely difficult to do, to have a readable book and also to make it a researched publication. Seems more or less a contradiction. But Manoj Da was a great storyteller, and he has achieved it in this. It's a well-researched biography, about 750 pages long, dealing with only the life of Sri Aurobindo up to the stage when he reached Pondicherry, that is the pre-Pondicherry phase, dealing just with that, 750 pages, very comprehensive, very well researched, and yet very readable. You can read it like a storybook. So that is what Manoj Da was. But if you want a shorter version of the same period, then there is a book that has been around for a very long time by Dr. Karan Singh, The Prophet of Indian Nationalism, which is based on the PhD thesis of Dr. Karan Singh. But once again, a very readable book published by Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, which, as I told you, was established by Professor K.M. Munshi, who was one of the students of Sri Aurobindo at Baroda. If you liked all the drawings that were there in these pictures, I tell you the artist's name is Subhash Chandra. He comes from an underprivileged family, and the ashram has been encouraging him. Thank you.
Anybody has any questions they can ask now?
Sir, namaste. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go on.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I don't have any question. So I have a query only that yesterday sir has told that this whole session will be in YouTube also available. So I checked that that is not available.
Well,
Uh,
we are a little handicapped in terms of both technology and manpower, but it will be there. Just have a
Okay,
little patience. It will
I
be.
have a suggestion that you can simultaneously live in YouTube also while in live in Zoom. There is an option. I don't know that option, but there is an option also. You can simultaneously live in YouTube.
Yes, but we did
You can
research
check it.
that there are two problems. Firstly, we thought that the quality of what we download, what we record and then upload will be better. Secondly, for example, we start 10 minutes before time. So yesterday we found that the first 10 minutes were silent, just showing those beginning slides. So that had to be deleted before we upload it. So that's why a little post-production work was needed. Otherwise, you would have had 10 minutes of silence throughout at the beginning of the video.
Okay, sir. Sure. Thank you, sir.
Questions
Good, yeah, good morning,
or comments?
Professor. Hello.
Yes, go on. We can hear you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Bijlani, for beautiful insight into Sri Aurobindo's life. I was actually just curious to understand the reasons why Sri Aurobindo went into seclusion for a period of more than 20 years. Because you say that, see, on one hand, it is about, you know, like the life affirmation. So continue, participating in your day to day life while also, continuing your spiritual pursuits. So I was just, yeah, I would like to just understand the reasons, maybe that the reasons why he went into seclusion for a prolonged period of time.
Of course, I mean, that's a question which probably he would be the best person to answer. But what we can sort of visualize is that after 1926, there was a sort of a division of work. Sri Aurobindo concentrating on the inner work. It's not that he was not working. He was concentrating on the inner work, whereas the mother was concentrating on the outer work. And both are important in integral yoga, as we shall see as the course goes on. Both are important. And while I mean, Sri Aurobindo was not apparently working, he was in seclusion, but as I said, he was answering the uh, questions that were sent to him in writing, and that took him a lot of time. Sometimes he had to sit till late at night to write the answers, detailed answers to all those questions. So he was still engaging with the disciples. And there are also indications, he has not talked about it, but the disciples can make out that he was participating not only in national affairs, but in the world affairs. For example, he did intervene also in the Second World War, because both he and the mother believed that if Hitler wins, it will be a victory of the Asuric forces, and the entire process of evolution might be pushed back by several hundred years. And therefore, he did use his occult force to participate, to assist the defeat of, to help in the defeat of Hitler. So all those are also sort of indications are available with some evidence. So it's not that he had cut himself off from the world, but through his occult vision, he was seeing what is going on all over the world and intervening as and when it was absolutely necessary. Apart from, of course, the answering the questions of the disciples and in that process giving us letters on yoga, and also Savitri, which has been sort of considered by the mother as a complete book, which has everything that a spiritual seeker might need.
Thank you so much, sir.
There's another question in the chat box by Ruchika. She's asking, if the world is a manifestation of the divine, why is it called Maya, illusion?
Yes, that's a good question. Why is it still called a Maya or an illusion? Well, I mean, for the time being, accepting that, yes, it is an illusion. What is an illusion? An illusion is not a piece of falsehood. An illusion is something appearing different from what it really is. You know, the classical example is that of a snake and a rope. Suppose a rope looks like a snake. So in that sense, it is not a snake, but it is a real rope. It's not that it is a piece of falsehood. The rope at least is real. So what we see is a tree. What we don't see is that the tree has behind its creation, and within it, what the life force that is there is a manifestation of the divine. We don't see the divine, but we see only the tree. So we see part of the tree. We don't see the tree as it really is, but it is a real tree. So therefore, the tree is real, human beings are real, animals are real, everything is real. They appear to us different from what they really are. We don't see the divine in all these things, and that is why we can call it an illusion. So an illusion is not a piece of falsehood. In fact, the Maya has been considered by Sri Aurobindo to be a great capacity of the divine. Just imagine the innumerable forms that the divine has assumed. And, it's like an actor having multiple roles in a movie. If an actor is able to do 3 or 4 roles properly, we say, oh, what a great actor. Now here we have the greatest of all actors playing millions of roles and remaining invisible. So it's a great capacity of the divine. It is not a fraud that the divine has played on us by trying to appear different from what it really is. It is that divine, but in a different form, in a form that is highly imperfect, but capable of moving towards perfection, and through the evolutionary thrust, moving towards perfection.
Yes, do we have more questions?
Any more questions in the chat box?
No, not in chat box, just...
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So I have 2 questions, in fact. So we studied our evolution theory, and as well as we know our Dasavatar is also resembled to that evolution theory. So in our Dasavatar, what we know that in Matsya Avatar, there is fish, and a king, a human king, he go and he bring a fish, and gradually that increase. That is Matsya Avatar. Then in Matsya Avatar, after Kurma Avatar, and in this way we will evolution came to man. So my question is, if that is the time of fish in evolution, then how a human king was there? It is a question. And one more question is, there is sometimes some say that the first person is Manu, and some says that the first person was that Prajapati Daksha. So I am a bit confused in this two. Who is the first, Manu or Prajapati Daksha? This is the question. Please answer these 2 questions, sir. Thank you.
details have been created by the human intellect. We have given all these names. The divine itself has not given itself those names. And therefore, the names are immaterial. And secondly, the avatar part, yes, it is a rough indication of the evolution. The forms that we have given to these avatars, or the forms that these avatars have assumed, give us an indication of the direction in which evolution has been taking place. But what is important is sort of to look at things in a little more comprehensive and global manner instead of going into minor details. As I say, that either you can count the leaves in a tree, or you can taste the mango in the tree. You can do one of the two things. You can't do both. So if we keep these minor details aside and go to the spirit behind them, rather than analyze them threadbare by going into hair-splitting detail, we will not really gain much. So that is not what is important. What is important is to realize that, yes, what is an avatar? The avatar is the divine itself descending to assume a certain form on earth. And what is the purpose of the avatar? The purpose of the avatar is to take the evolution on earth one step further. So these are the two broad things that Sri Aurobindo has emphasized in essays on the Gita. And what was the other question? I have tried to mix up the two questions. And again, I mean,
yes,
whether
you
Manu was
answered
first
both.
or some
Thank you.
Prajapati was first, again, that is a moot point, because the divine was there, always there, and will always be there. That is Anadi and Ananta. That has no beginning and end. That is what is important. The names that we have given to some forms which may be mythological, maybe historical, or maybe whatever they are. But the names we have given, then those are human creations of we people who are ourselves neither the beginning nor the end, but manifestation of the one that has no beginning and no end. Then you'll say, if it has no beginning, then who gave rise to that? That is a question we don't go into. That is a question we don't go into because it is something which we can sort of ignore and live with that type of ignorance. Some people say these days, that is unscientific, because you are still failing to answer one question on rational grounds. But then can science also does the same? You know something, but you don't know the reason behind it. So you do a piece of research and you find out the reason. Then you have the reason, but then finding out that reason has generated some more questions to which you don't have the answers. In other words, you try to go to the reason behind the reason. And then you do some more research, you find that out. So you keep going backwards. Finally, where do you reach in science? Finally reach a point where you say that beyond this, I don't know. So science does the same, even with ordinary facts about the physical universe. But in the process, it generates enough knowledge to be used as working knowledge, which works well enough for us to be able to put a man on the moon. Now, here again, we are going back and back and back and reaching a point where we are talking of the very beginning. What was there before the beginning? We don't know. And we say that it is unscientific. Now, what is unscientific about it? You've gone back much further back than science ever does. You're not dealing only with the physical universe, but with all aspects of whatever exists. And still we say this is unscientific. But in fact, science stops much before this does, firstly. And second, the science still is able to give us enough knowledge to put a man on the moon, which means that working knowledge is useful. So spirituality also gives us, in the process of going back, enough knowledge which will work and which works and which helps us live a better life for ourselves as well as for the rest of the world. So let's use that as working knowledge and use it for the purpose for which it is very useful, instead of arguing over the question, what was the beginning, who was the beginning, what was there before the beginning. Now, those are the questions which we can ignore and be comfortable with that ignorance. Okay.
Just one last question for today. Mukund is asking, did Sri Aurobindo try to prevent division of India? If yes, in what way? If not, then why not? If you could answer that.
Well, one sort of intervention which Sri Aurobindo did make in the freedom struggle, and I mean,
No, you can continue.
Sri Aurobindo didn't sort of participate in the freedom struggle once he went to Pondicherry. But at one point, he did make give some advice, and that was that we can accept the proposals of the Cripps mission. You know, when Cripps came to India with a certain proposals, he said we can accept those. And if that had been accepted, there was a possibility that the division could have been prevented. So he did try. Apparently, he didn't succeed. But then in the 15th August 1947 message, he has given an assurance which is brief and cryptic, but all the same, it says there that the division will go. How and when? Difficult to say. He himself has said that, but it will go. So how the divine forces will work to achieve what Sri Aurobindo had visualized in 1947 is something that time will unfold. But he tried, and then in spite of the division that took place, he also gave the assurance in 1947 that the division will go.
All right, we don't have any more questions. So we end today's class. Okay, I see Kajal's hand up. Kajal, you have 1 minute if you could quickly unmute and ask your question, and then that will be the last.
Sir, I want to ask that when Sri Aurobindo left his body, why was his body emitting light?
Because I said it was not an ordinary body. It had undergone the type of transformation Sri Aurobindo has talked about. You know, he said that even matter or the body will be transformed, and his body had undergone that type of a transformation, and that is was it was not subject to the laws of decay, and instead it was emitting a light which the mother could show Dr. Sanyal, you know, who was looking after Sri Aurobindo in his illness, during his illness. So she showed that light to Dr. Sanyal. So again, I mean, it required a higher force, the type of force that the mother had to be able to see that light. Any other questions? And with that bhajan. So we'll have some devotional music for 2 minutes. We were talking about love. The song is also about love. Love is the key to the transformation of the world.
बिना हो बस प्यार ही प्यार है, एक ऐसे गगन के तले आ चल के तुझे मैं लेके चलूं, एक ऐसे गगन के तले जहाँ गम भी ना हो, आंसू भी ना हो, बस प्यार ही प्यार भरे, एक ऐसे गगन के तले सपनों की ऐसे जहाँ में जहाँ प्यार ही प्यार खिला हो, सपनों की ऐसे जहाँ में जहाँ प्यार ही प्यार खिला हो, हम जाके एक ऐसी गगन की तले
All right. Thank you everyone for joining today. Tomorrow we will have the class at the same time, and the topic for tomorrow's session will be on the mother. Thank you once again. Have a good day ahead. Thank you.